Rock and roll. All right. Well, I am here with Jared Freeman. Morning, Jared. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm great. We're here to talk about muscular fitness today. And this is a very large and broad topic. I think when you first hear the words muscular fitness, you assume it's about big muscles, bodybuilders, competitive bench pressers, but it's so much more than that. And like many things in exercise science and human physiology, it's so much more nuanced than what most people actually realize. So we're going to dive into this discussion right now with the understanding that we're going to talk about a lot, but we're going to merely scratch the surface of this monstrous topic that is muscular fitness. And not only is it monstrous because there's so much to talk about, but it's monstrous because it's so important, and it's beyond the scope of our conversation today, but conversations in the future that we're going to have, we'll talk about the role that muscular fitness plays in longevity and vitality and disease reduction. Not only is this an important conversation because it is complex and nuanced, but it's important because it's really vital to human health and human well-being. With that said, let's start with the most fundamental question here, Jared, which is how would you define muscular fitness?
It'd be a long definition, but I think the easiest way is it's an umbrella term for 5 different trainable capacities of human skeletal muscle. So, I mean, once you that's the umbrella term, and then obviously each capacity is going to have its own definition and term as well.
Yeah, so all these capacities are interrelated in some ways we're going to discuss. And ultimately, they allow the muscle to perform all the activities that we need to do during the course of our day, from picking up a heavy object off the ground, to going up a flight of stairs, to reaching up above our head, and any number of things that we ask our body to do from a physical demand standpoint. The muscles have to meet that demand with these 5 different interrelated capacities. So let's first get into these 5 capacities. I think a good place to begin is we can name them and we can define them, but then I also think it's important to give not only weight room based examples, but also real world examples of these different capacities of muscular fitness. So why don't you start and just name them off, and then we can get into the different definitions.
Okay. Yep. You got strength, power, endurance, hypertrophy, and flexibility are the 5.
Awesome. And we've kind of added in flexibility to this discussion. And as we explain it towards the end, we're going to talk about it probably a little bit more in the context of mobility. But let's start with muscular strength, because I think you would agree that this is the most fundamental capacity that the muscle needs to possess to perform all of its functional tasks. So how would you define strength?
I think the technical definition is just the ability to produce a high level of force. And it's independent of speed of production of force. And I mean, I always tell people life is you versus gravity, or you versus external objects being pulled by gravity. So that's why it's critical to developing strength and maintaining a level of strength.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we think about this in a performance context, I think the easiest way to think of it would be a competitive power lifter who's doing a 1 rep max bench, a 1 rep max squat, a 1 rep max deadlift. That's the performance context. But in the context of daily life, if you think about it, every single activity we do is performed with some degree of muscular strength that is relative to our percentage of max. So let's say you have to bend over and you have to pick up something that is 15 pounds off the ground. Let's say it's a box of tile that's on the ground. Well, for you as a middle-aged, strong man, that 15-pound box is going to be a very low percentage of your 1 rep max. So it's not going to be a very high strength output. But if you take a 75 or an 80-year-old woman who has to bend over and pick up that very same thing, that might be 90% of her maximum capability to produce strength. So everything we do during our day is done at a percentage of our maximal strength. And the stronger we are, the lower the percentages that we're doing things at during our day, the easier those activities become.
Yeah, that's the direct interplay of strength and endurance. Like I can pick up that 15-pound object 500 times before I need to take a break. Whereas if that's a really high percentage of your absolute strength, you might be able to pick it up 3 times before you have to take a break. So it also has that interplay with endurance as well.
Yeah. Well, with that said, let's define endurance real quick and we can talk about that.
Yeah, it's the ability to produce a submaximal force continuously or repetitively.
Yeah. So this is something where we're resisting fatigue while producing that force. So to your point a second ago, you might be able to pick up that 15-pound object 500 times before you fatigue, whereas somebody else may only be able to pick it up 3 or 4 times before they fatigue. Part of that is certainly because of the fact that they have a different level of maximal muscular strength, but also there are other changes that we'll talk about it that occur in the muscle that allow it to produce that metabolic capacity.
Yes.
So in the context of performance, you might think of running a 5K or something like that. But in the context of daily life, muscular endurance could be, carrying the groceries in from the car. I know where I live, my garage is on the bottom level of my condo, and then I go up 2 flights of stairs to get the groceries to my kitchen, which is certainly for somebody like me that doesn't do a lot of cardio, definitely an aerobic challenge, but there's also a muscular endurance challenge there in my legs, in my hands. Now, fortunately for me, because I lift weights and I have good strength, I'm not really impaired in that endurance task, but it certainly requires endurance to do that. So both performance and activities daily life, endurance is critical for. Now, earlier you mentioned power and then you define strength. And I think most people will take power and strength and use those terms interchangeably. You hear like a sports announcer say that athlete's strong, that athlete's powerful, and they may be both of those same things, but they're not, or both of those things I should say, but they're not the same thing. What's the distinction?
Of the velocity component gets added in with power. So I mean, remember probably high school physics. I don't remember high school physics, but I think it's power is force times velocity. So you got your force, which is your strength, and then it's multiplied by how fast you do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Or power is also work divided by time. The more work you can do in a shorter period of time or in the same period of time, the more powerful you are. And from a performance context, all sports involve an element of power. Everything that's done in sport, it's not just absolute force produced with no regard to speed. It is producing nearly maximum forces at nearly maximal speeds. The person who is fastest to produce their force wins. But in daily life, and this is where I would argue that once you've developed muscular strength, you develop that foundation of strength, power may be most critical to functional capacity because we use it when we go up a flight of stairs. We use it when we stand up out of a chair or get up off the toilet. I challenge anyone to try to go up a flight of stairs or stand up from their chair slowly. It's nearly impossible to do. Try to jump slowly. If you don't believe me that certain activities are critical for power, try a slow jump. You actually can't do a slow jump, and getting up out of a chair slowly is difficult. As a quick example, we know that the power of the tibialis anterior, which is responsible for ankle dorsiflexion, pulling your toes up towards your knees, that's actually a predictor of falls in the elderly. So power has very real world implications in terms of not only regular activities of daily life, but what we'd consider instrumental activities of daily life, like walking and standing up and going up a flight of stairs.
Yep. And if you look at the statistics on falls and fractures in the elderly, it's not a good outcome if you actually do fall. So it seems like something so trivial, but having good power in your tibialis anterior, it can actually extend your life significantly.
Yeah. And it's beyond the scope of our discussion today. And I'm sure we'll get into this in future conversations, but we know that power is the one muscular fitness capacity that deteriorates the fastest with age. We commonly think of it as muscle mass or strength, but it's really power first, beyond the scope of this discussion. But staying with that, let's talk about muscular hypertrophy. What is this?
Muscular, it's my favorite.
Yeah.
It's one I'm not the best at, but it's my favorite. So it's the ability to increase muscle fiber size. So cross-sectional area of the actual muscle fiber. And I think it's, in my opinion, it's one of the one that it's the most misunderstood, because it instantly goes to like a physique or vanity bend to the conversation. That's what people instantly think of. But muscle is like, it's one of the most important tissues on your body as you age, for maintaining functional capacity, blood sugar regulation, cardiac and cancer survival rates when you have cardiac incidences or cancer. So it's actually a very, very important tissue in the body that goes well beyond just the way somebody looks.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you said that, because that is, when we talk about muscular hypertrophy from an aesthetic perspective, that's on the extreme fringes
Yes.
of the continuum when we think of bodybuilders and physique athletes. But when we go back to strength being the foundational capacity, we know that strength is directly correlated with cross-sectional area of muscle. So as cross-sectional area deteriorates, strength deteriorates. And then to carry that one step further, since power is basically the product of force times velocity, as strength reduces, force reduces, therefore power reduces. So this is really a element of muscular fitness that has first order connections to nearly all the other elements of muscular fitness. So I think we need to think of this more broadly than just big bulging muscles. And I think we'll say this briefly now and then talk about it in future conversations. There's no individual on this planet that can build a substantial amount of muscle mass to the point where they'd be, quote unquote, big and bulky without a great degree of careful intentionality to everything that they're doing. The average human being, if they're putting on a quarter pound of muscle in a month, is doing a great job, right? Physique athletes that do everything right, their nutrition, their sleep, their training, like maybe some of those guys or gals at some point in their career put on a pound of muscle in a month. So this is not a tissue that you can just add copious amounts of relatively quickly, but you can lose it with age, right?
Yeah, very fast. I think it's I might not have the age correct, but I think it's after age 35 you start to see marked reductions in muscle tissue.
Yeah. And again, there's those knock-on effects of that on force production and on power production. So if nothing else, maintaining your level of muscle mass is critical, but ideally increasing it is more desirable because of its improvements in strength, as you said, metabolic function with regard to the diabetes and being a reservoir for glucose and carbohydrate, a whole host of benefits. And we'll dive a little bit further into that. The last thing I'll say on this before we get to flexibility is that the good news is that the loss of muscle tissue with age, which is referred to as sarcopenia, it is not a fate that we are all necessarily doomed to experience at an extreme level. There will be some reduction in muscle tissue with age, but we know from research that trained individuals, people who just train on a recreation level, can have levels of muscle mass comparable to untrained or moderately trained individuals that are 20 years younger. So you can actually turn back the aging clock to a degree, which I think is so exciting. Let's talk about flexibility. And last, but certainly not least, because this is important to functional capacity. How would you define flexibility?
It's the muscle and connective tissues of the body, their ability to go through a full functional range of motion.
Right. And functional is important because we talk of flexibility, and I think the immediate thing that comes to your mind, we're during the Olympics right now as we're recording this, the immediate thing that comes to your mind is Simone Biles or some gymnast doing some crazy acrobatic flexibility move. Well, for that individual, that would be considered functional. But for the majority of us, functional flexibility just means the ability to reach behind you in the car and grab something off the back seat, or it means the ability to squat down and pick something off the ground properly. We used that example earlier of the 15-pound box of tile off the ground. Like, to pick that up properly, yes, you need strength, but you also need good flexibility in your hip flexors, in your spinal erectors, the muscles of your chest and your shoulder girdle. So again, these are all very interrelated capacities, and flexibility is something that too can decline with age. And there are some physiological reasons to that in terms of actual anatomical changes to the connective tissue matrix. But here, once again, this is something that you can attenuate with properly addressing it with an exercise intervention. And so all of these things are very plastic. They're very able to be malleable in either direction.
Yep.
Before we get into talking about the different adaptations quickly and kind of how you go about achieving these different aspects of muscular fitness, I think it's important we talk about the motor unit, because it's really where a lot of this discussion centers around in terms of how the adaptive response occurs and is effectuated in the muscle. So let's define a motor unit. Let's get people to start to understand this concept a little bit more.
Yeah, so this is the relationship between kind of the brain and the muscle. So you have your motor cortex, you have your motor nerves. The motor nerves carry signals from the brain to the muscle. Then you have your motor unit, which is the motor nerve, and then all of the muscle fibers that motor nerve innervates. And it can be large or small. So like in your eyeball where you have really fine movements, obviously it's much smaller than where in your quad or something like a bigger muscle, you're going to have, it's going to be larger.
Yeah. And so this is important because muscle contraction, skeletal muscle contraction is under our volitional control in normal states. So we have to send the signal from the brain to actually turn the muscle on, but it's more complicated than that because it's not like we just contract the whole muscle all at once. If we did that, it would actually be disastrous for the majority of activities we perform. We have the ability to grade force production. So, if in my bicep right here, I want to pick up a light object off the ground. I have a mouse below me here. If I wanted to pick that up off the ground, I don't want to fire all of my motor units in my bicep because I would throw that mouse through the ceiling. I want to fire the right amount of them. And even though it'll look like my whole bicep is contracting when I go to pick that mouse up off the ground, turns out that only a few of the motor units in the bicep are contracting that are allowing a couple hundred muscle fibers to contract. If I was going to go pick a 60-pound dumbbell up off the ground, then I'd get closer to my level of maximal motor unit recruitment. Now, the reason this is so important to this discussion, with some exceptions in certain scenarios, is that only active motor units in muscle produce force. Therefore, only active motor units in muscle actually undergo adaptive modification to training. Meaning, on a high level, if you do not train with a broad spectrum of repetitions from relatively low to relatively high, let's just say in the low end for the average general population client, 4 to 6, and in the high end upwards of 15 to 20, if you're not training in those lower rep ranges with higher loads, you are leaving some motor units inactive. Therefore, you're leaving some adaptation in those muscle fibers on the table. Now, there are certain scenarios, and you and I talked about this offline, where if you are doing sets of 10 to 15 reps with maximal loads to failure, you're probably going to recruit a lot of the motor units and muscle fibers in a muscle, but that's assuming a very high intensity workout, which probably isn't appropriate for the vast majority of general population clients. So would you say it's safe to say that training through the spectrum of repetitions is critically important to fully developing muscular fitness capacity?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I also, it's important to vary the loading for other reasons as well. I mean, this, again, it's beyond the scope of this conversation, but if you train only really, really heavy or only really, really light, you could possibly come across some other issues. I know when I was in a really, really heavy strength training phase for a while, I started to develop some aches and pains in joints and things of that nature. So I think that it's important for other reasons. But yeah, I would agree from a recruitment perspective that for the vast majority of people that aren't taking it to that level of intensity or failure, that training through a large variety is the best to build out the capacities.
Yeah, love it. Well, let's jump real quick into the different elements of muscular fitness and how to actually train these. Now, the caveat I'm going to put on all of these right off the bat is that any strength training you do, almost no matter how you do it, if you're a novice, is going to improve all these components of muscular fitness. And certainly when you're entering into a strength training program, you need some level of general anatomical and physiological adaptation before you really focus with a high degree of specificity on your workouts. Beyond the scope of our conversation today, what I want to do quickly, Jared, is I want to drill down on some of the different adaptations we see associated with these different kinds of muscular fitness, and then quickly talk about some of the training parameters that are associated with achieving these levels of muscular fitness. Training parameters being sets, rep ranges, rest intervals, and so on. So let's start with the component we identified as most important, being muscular strength. What are some of the adaptations that we see happen to improve strength of skeletal muscle?
Yeah, so anatomically, you get your hypertrophy of the muscle fiber, so the increase in cross-sectional area. Neurologically, so that brain to muscle, mind body connection, you're going to get increased recruitment of motor units. So you're going to recruit more of them. You're going to get increased synchronization. So when those motor units fire, they fire over a shorter period of time. So you get a higher magnitude of contraction. You're going to get increased muscle spindle activity, and then a decreased GTO activity. So Golgi tendon organ, GTO, that's going to decrease a little bit.
Yeah. So, and the muscle spindle and the GTO are these proprioceptors in the muscle that sense changes in force production and changes in length. I don't want to dive too deep into that right now, but there's a lot of neurological adaptations that occur to drive strength changes in the muscle. And largely this is facilitated by 2 to 3 whole body workouts per week, 2 to 4 sets per muscle group. Tends to be 4 to 8 reps per set, maybe 1 to 6 reps per set for someone who's a little bit more advanced. Could be 80% and upwards of 1 rep max, and then 2 to 3 minute rests between sets. So in general, that's how we go about improving strength. Now, power is interesting to piggyback on the back end of strength, because a lot of the adaptations are pretty similar here. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, anatomically, you don't need, for an increase in power, you don't need hypertrophy of muscle fibers, because there's that neuromuscular connection. You see people when they first start training, their bench press, the first day they ever bench press, they might bench press 65 pounds for 10 reps. And then the next day, 10 reps, they saw 5 in the tank. So there's definitely the ability to improve strength and power, explosiveness without increasing hypertrophy. But the neurological adaptations are essentially the same as strength. Yeah,
except now we're favoring kind of a higher velocity rate of contraction. So if strength, it's the magnitude of the signal that's sent from the central nervous system. With power, it's the magnitude and the speed of the signal that's sent. So we're seeing recruitment and synchronization improvements. We're seeing those proprioceptive adaptations. We are seeing improvements in something called the stretch shortening cycle, which is a neurological reflex that it basically utilizes the elastic element of muscle and connective tissue. And then anatomically, and you were right to downplay it, we don't tend to see massive increases in hypertrophy with power-based training. But if we think of an Olympic lifter, Olympic lifters are people that do lifts for power. Those are very muscular individuals. So there is a power element. And there are some other elasticity adaptations in connective tissue with power training. So power training is definitely subtly different than strength, but largely neurologically based adaptations. And what's interesting is when you look at the training parameters for the workouts, they're very, very similar to the training parameters of a strength-based workout. So typically you're doing 2 to 3 whole body workouts per week. You're doing 2 to 4 sets per muscle. So very much the same way it is when you're talking about a strength workout. You tend to be doing somewhere between 4 to 8 reps per set, where you're emphasizing speed of contraction. But here's the rub. You're doing it with 30 to 60% of your 1 rep max, rather than doing it with the 80+% of your 1 rep max. Simply put, you're going lower weight so you can go with higher speed during the contraction.
Exactly. Analogy than the one I gave is, we'll see this from a power perspective without hypertrophy of muscle tissue, is when you look at like an athlete's vertical jump in the first 4 weeks of training, going up an inch or two. without any change in muscle tissue.
Yeah.
It's just that improved recruitment of motor units, and then the synchronization of motor units are probably the two biggest things that they're getting right off the bat there. So it's absent of hypertrophy, but you get massive increases in power.
Yes, which for athletes and even activities of daily life, it's certainly advantageous.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into hypertrophy a little bit here.
Yeah.
And man, this could be a complicated discussion. And I know you and I are both very passionate about this and can dive pretty deep, but let's keep this on a surface level, just so people understand some of the requisite adaptations that occur here. Most of them are anatomically based. So let's kind of suss that out a little bit, and then we can get into the parameters.
Yeah. So, I mean, the biggest thing is an actual accretion of the muscle protein. So actin, myosin, actual growth and accretion of that protein to increase the cross-sectional area. So that's probably the biggest adaptation, I guess, when you get that true hypertrophy. And then there's also sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which is kind of the increase in various structures within the muscle, such as fluid, mitochondria, things of that nature.
Yeah, and there's definitely some points of contention among researchers with regard to sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. But basically, as Jared said, you've got what we refer to as myofibrillar hypertrophy or classical hypertrophy, which is the increase in the protein content of the muscle. And we think of that as protein synthesis, and we think of that as making more fibers. But really, as you said, it's increasing the contractile myofilaments. And that's the primary mechanism for hypertrophy. But then you likely have this secondary mechanism that is an increase in non-contractile protein elements, such as fluid and all of the other organelles that sit inside of the skeletal muscle. That likely contributes as well to a lesser degree. Now, there are many different mechanisms that drive hypertrophy that are beyond the scope of this discussion. In the article that accompanies this discussion, we talk a little bit more about those mechanisms. We link off to a good article that talks about, even in greater depth and detail, those mechanisms. But for the purposes of this discussion, just realize here we're talking about building up more contractile proteins in the muscle. And to do that, the frequency that you train with is normally 2 to 3 times per week per muscle, which doesn't necessarily mean you're only lifting 2 to 3 times per week. Traditionally, people that do hypertrophy workouts will do a split routine where maybe they'll do chest, shoulders, triceps on Monday. They might do legs, back, biceps on Wednesday, and then they might do a whole body workout on Friday. So here we're critically talking about a frequency of training everything at least 2, if not 3 days a week for certain individuals. Normally it's 2 to 8 sets per muscle group, depending on the size of the muscle. Bigger muscle groups get more sets. Traditionally, it's 8 to 12 reps per set, which can vary a little bit depending on the program, but typically that's the classical range. Here, the rest interval is 1 to 2 minutes in between sets, whereas for strength and power, it'd be 2 to 3 minutes and upward between sets. So hypertrophy, the goal here is basically put a lot of tension on the muscle, damage the muscle, build up a lot of metabolic stress. So we really encourage that myofibrillar hypertrophy, but also to a lesser degree, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Yep. Let's talk about endurance. Endurance adaptations here again are a little different. Unlike hypertrophy, where we're largely anatomical adaptations, these are a little bit different.
Yeah. So you want the physiological adaptations?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's quite a few to endurance. Your capillary density is going to increase. Your mitochondrial density is going to increase. The amount of ATP, the fuel substrate for muscle contraction, is going to increase. Stored creatine increases. Stored glycogen increases. Stored triglycerides increases. So all those things that act as fuel for the muscle are going to increase significantly.
Yeah. Basically what you're saying is you're first improving the metabolic machinery or the metabolic engine to be able to produce energy for a sustained period of time while resisting fatigue. And then you're also increasing the gas tank. So if we were to think of the engine and the gas analogy, the engine is largely the mitochondria, right? And then we have the gas is the triglycerides, the glycogen, and then there's the enzymes and all the things that make changes, like the pistons and all the other components in the engine that make your engine grow. And then there are some cardiovascular adaptations that occur. You mentioned increased capillary density. The easiest way to think of that is that's like putting the gas station closer to the freeway. So when you get off the expressway, you have to drive less far to be able to get your fuel. And then the heart actually becomes a stronger pump, and there's all these central adaptations. So these adaptations start to take on those that you would typically see with cardiovascular training, but because of the structure of muscular endurance based workouts, they tend to favor more of the peripheral adaptations with the muscle and the circulatory system versus the central adaptations of the heart.
Yep.
And in terms of the training parameters here, we're talking about 2 to 3 times per week frequency. You see, that's a really common theme, right? For most individuals, lifting 2 to 3 times per week is more than adequate. In fact, doing anything more than that sometimes can be counterproductive. Here again, 2 to 4 sets per muscle, 15 to 20 plus reps per set. So we're talking about very, very high numbers of repetitions, sometimes, in excess of 50 or 100 repetitions. Low loads, 50 to 60% of 1 rep max, and short rest intervals to really stress the fuel production capacity of the muscle, 30 to 60-second rest between sets for endurance. Typically, you'll see these done as circuit workouts in a lot of cases, where people will do one exercise after the other, after the other, after the other. Let's get on to flexibility. Last but not least, and when you and I were talking about this off air, you mentioned the term mobility may be a better term than flexibility here, and I like that. So we talked about flexibility being the ability to go through a full and unencumbered functional range of motion, but mobility is a little different. So let's intersect these things and then touch on this real quick.
Yeah, I think of flexibility as more of like extending or flexing, like the hamstring. Look at the hamstring and how, if your leg is straight and you're laying on your back, how far up can you lift your hamstring? So yes, your hip's going through a range of motion, but it's really isolating out that single muscle to see how the extensibility of that muscle. Whereas mobility is I hate the word functional, but it's a more like real life functional measure of how somebody moves. And it's kind of the intersection of strength, local muscle flexibility, and then also like technical skill. So someone could technically have tight-ish hamstrings, or they could feel tight. A lot of times they're actually lacking flexibility to just feel like they are. But they could actually move through a full range of motion in a squat with great mobility. So I guess that's kind of the difference between the two. Is flexibility I see as more of an isolated thing to a specific muscle, whereas mobility is how does the whole system work together with muscles that contract around a joint, muscles that stretch when a joint moves, and then what does that look like when you look at movement as a whole?
Yeah, I love it. Basically what you're saying here is flexibility kind of occurs in a vacuum, whereas mobility occurs with the interrelationship between bones and muscles and motor skill. And I think it's a more appropriate term. Now, saying that, the best way, at least as we're going to talk about it right now, to improve flexibility that leads to greater mobility is actually full range of motion strength training. Now, that's not to say that there's not benefit to doing static or dynamic stretching, because there certainly is. They have their place in a workout. But somebody who can do a full range of motion squat where they're actually getting below parallel, their butts dropping almost all the way to their heels, that's someone who has incredible functional flexibility. Now, most people don't need that degree of flexibility, but if you think about when we talk in terms of mobility, like you said, never, ever are we asked to produce a functional range of motion where we're not doing it while producing force at the same time. And while we're also needing to produce some type of motor skill with some degree of precision to be able to do a required movement pattern properly. So I think this is one of those things where you should stretch statically or dynamically, when appropriate, dynamically before exercise, statically after exercise. But consider that going through full range of motion in strength training, no matter what the exercise, is the best way to actually improve mobility based upon the definition that Jared gave. So Jared, I'm happy you brought that up, and we'll have other discussions about how to optimize all of these components of muscular fitness. But I want to bring this to a close with saying this. This is a very complicated and nuanced conversation. We took a term muscular fitness, which maybe a lot of you that were listening thought, oh, I know what muscular fitness is. And then we expanded it exponentially during this 20, 25-minute discussion. We still haven't done justice to how to actually truly effectuate significant change in muscular fitness and all these different subcomponents in this short conversation. I realize you just can't take somebody who's never strength trained before and have them do the strength or power workout that we talked about earlier and hope that it's going to go well. So in the future, we're going to have conversations around periodization and progression and how to ensure you're taking into consideration the totality of someone's baseline level of muscular fitness, what their functional needs are, and how to program for that. But for right now, we hope that you have a basic understanding of what muscular fitness is, how the motor unit and its associated muscle fibers influence the development of muscular fitness, and then what those different subdomains are. So Jared, this is a great discussion here. You and I can go on for hours on this, and we will in subsequent conversations. But for now, I think this provides a pretty good overview.
Yeah, I agree.
Awesome. Well, Jared, thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Good work.
It's good. Went a little off tangent on the power discussion. I should have used the vertical jump example instead of the reps example, but
that's okay. No, this is good, dude. These are great. These are great conversations. The great thing about this is so easy for you and I to have. It's just like we're sitting here talking about this. Yeah. So I love it.
Yeah. All right. I hope staff members are actually diving into it.
Yeah, we'll see. We start next week at the education in Plymouth and the following week in Ann Arbor.
How are you sending that out to the staff?
I'm emailing it out individually to the staffs at the facility when I'm doing the education, like the week before. So I haven't said anything to Rochester. You can do whatever you want in terms of Rochester.
Can you, when you send it out to either Plymouth or it doesn't matter, Plymouth or Ann Arbor, just send it to include me on one of those, and then I'll send it from there.
Okay, awesome. I'll make a note of that right now.
Cool.
And I'll send it right now to you for the first.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just give me a reminder to send out each of these to my team once they're all like put together. So
cool.
I mean, I have like 3 people on my team, but they'll still be good.
Never hurts. All right, dude. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. See ya.
Okay, bye.